All right, the checklist itself. So a lot of this, obviously, is stuff that you all do on a monthly basis as well. So, I mean, obviously, clearing out the year includes clearing or closing out, not clearing, closing out December. So, obviously, like you do every month, you need to validate your shipments, and you can either do that, as you know, validate the shipments one by one, or you could do a utility where you mass do multiple shipments at once, the same as sales invoices and credit memos. Sales invoices, obviously, you have two different types of sales invoices. You have your product-related invoices, as well as those invoices that may not be product-related. And as well, so obviously those need to be posted, again, either one by one or using a mass or using one of those utilities to print or to batch post. Your receipt and your stock journals, the journal or the accounting interface, obviously that in your case, for most of you, it's probably done at night. But obviously at this time of year, we probably might want to run it a couple times, make sure that it is running, that it's not stuck, but obviously you want to make sure that all your stock transactions and all your receipt transactions have been posted. Purchase invoice and credit memos, just like sales invoice, obviously there is a purchase-related invoices, product-related invoices, excuse me, and those invoices that are not product-related, your expenses, rent, so forth, obviously those as well need to be posted and validated before you run. And again, those can be done either manually or with a batch posting. For those of you who are using bank posting, those obviously need to be posted. So again, your receipts, your cash receipts, or your payments, obviously those can be again posted one by one, or using a utility to post multiple or a range of bank postings. We obviously want to, again, we talk about stock, but obviously this is the time of year where a lot of you might be doing the physical inventory if you're not on a cycle count already. Obviously, as consultants, we would recommend you get on a cycle count at some point, but for those of you who are not on a physical cycle count yet, we will make sure that do your physical inventory and any kind of adjustments as well. The last two, work in progress and subcontractor, they have similar postings, but obviously you want to make sure that any WIP has been validated and posted, as well as any subcontracting. Again, they kind of have some similar postings. So again, you might want to run some utilities or a report to show what hasn't been validated as well, and make sure that those two have been validated. So again, your end checklist does include obviously your month-end checklist as well, but these are obviously some things that that need to be posted before you can go through year end. Part of obviously your year-end checklist is you're looking at your journal entry ledgers, or excuse me, your journal entries. So making sure that you run any allocations. So of those of you who are using the allocation feature in X3, either for accounts or dimensions, make sure that you ran those. Obviously, make sure that you enter your accruals or provisions for the year. Obviously, that's important for those of you who do the accruals, so as soon as you can get that entered for December, that would be great. Obviously, making sure that you run any reversals. For those of you who are using reversals in X3, you obviously can either do it one by one, or you can run a utility to do, if you've set it up that way, to run multiple reversals at one time. I know a lot of people have reversals where they'll just use the function to reverse based on the individual journal entry itself, but you obviously do have it where you can do a range of reversals at one time, so that needs to be done. Your fixed assets depreciation, that obviously needs to be ran, and like I told you all earlier, and some of you know that use fixed assets, it is its own little animal, as I call it, but you post it on its own, and you obviously have to run that depreciation, and any other kind of postings that might have happened for December. So if you've had any kind of fixed asset revaluation, or if you've sold any fixed assets, or you've retired some fixed assets, obviously that will need to be run as well. Your InterSite, for those of you who have InterSite or intercompany, obviously if you have any cash transactions that need to take place or anything that you need to transfer back and forth, make sure that those are ran as well. And lastly here on at least the general ledger checklist here is your variances, your clearing accounts, your return not invoiced accounts, your sold not invoiced account, and your 99 account. You know, it's a good time of year to look at these. Run a report. There's obviously a few utilities out there, and there's a couple of reports, especially for the RNI and the SNI accounts. Make sure that those numbers make sense to you all. Make sure that they are as they are, or as they are supposed to be. As consultants, we obviously try to make sure that your accounting codes are all set up correctly, but every once in a while we will set a default, if you will, 999 account, which is your suspense account for most of you. So if you notice that if you ever have transactions that are hitting these accounts erroneously, that probably shouldn't be, 9 out of 10 times it's going to be your accounting code. So again, if you got something that's hitting your 999 account and it's not supposed to be, definitely look at your accounting codes, because oftentimes, again, as consultants, when we're not sure of an account, sometimes we'll just enter that 999 so we can get some things posted through. So hopefully that's been cleaned up for you. But for you, some of you new on X3, you definitely want to look that out. And again, if there's some mistakes, you can't figure it out, please let us know and we can help you through it. But 9 out of 10 times it's because the accounting code is set up incorrectly. To continue with the checklist as well, obviously before you close the year, you need to do a final validation of journal entries. And again, this is obviously part of your month-end process as well, but you need to run that final validation. And as you know, most journal entries come over as a temporary status. That temporary status obviously allows you to edit, to obviously delete if you need to, and so forth. Running the final validation will make that a final journal entry, so at that point, any kind of adjustments to that journal entry would have to be either a reversing entry or an adjustment entry at that point. It's kind of hard behind the scenes once you validate a journal entry to change it. It's also a great time to look at those entries that may be wrong, and if it comes from maybe a sales journal or a non-product related purchase journal, best to do accounting and cancellation and fix it at that end, rather at the purchasing invoice level, rather than the account or at the GL level itself. There is once you do a final validation, as many of you know, by month, it does give you the pre-closing report that shows all your blocking errors. So hopefully the longer you go with X3, the thinner or the smaller that report gets, which means you're making progress with your X3 and your business process itself. But obviously that report itself will list any kind of errors that would block you from validating those final entries for the month. Part of year-end as well is obviously, as a very simplistic, but you obviously need to close the stock period as well as the normal period close. So when you run, and as well as you run the final period close, X3 will notify you, hey, you're at the end of the month, at the end of the year, do you wish to continue? One thing that obviously we've got to make sure of, or you need to make sure of, is that 2017 and at least January of 2017 is open. And I have a screenshot and a slide coming up, and I'll show you where that is. But obviously you need to make sure that 2017 has been defined and is open, and as well as January. Most of the time people would open January through December, but again, at least January needs to be open. And then lastly is another pre-closing report, CLOPER. This obviously is it gives you some errors, or a report that would, if you will, look at the transactions that might cause you some errors when you close the period. So make sure to run that as well. All right, closing the year. So there's a couple of setups that, especially for some of you who are brand new to X3, and this would be your first year doing a year end. There's a couple of document types and journal codes that you need to make sure are entered. And as the consultants, hopefully we've done that. But if we've missed that for year end, just something that you all should verify in itself. So obviously the document type for a new period needs to be created, and I have a screenshot of what that looks like itself. And most of you make sure that you either have a sequence counter defined using the X3 sequence counter, or a sequence counter that you define itself. Usually, especially when it comes to new period, the NANEW is a good enough sequence counter for most. But if you do have something specialized, obviously you would need to define that there. as well as these two sections down here, and I'm hoping you all can see my mouse, but under the ledger, as you know, you do have several different ledger options in X3. We've got a ledger, the analytical, and the IAS ledger. Most of you are only on one ledger. Most U.S. companies really are. So make sure that the ledger 1 is authorized, and just equally as important, making sure that the other two are not authorized. If you have them both authorized, and you try to do a year-end and you really truly don't have an analytical ledger, X3 is not going to like that. It's going to try to look for things that don't exist. So make sure that the legal and the analytical and the IS, legal again marked as authorized and the analytical as none. Account classes also need to be defined correctly. So account classes, obviously in my example, assets, liabilities, and capital will need to be carried forward. But for a code number 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, those expense related, obviously those are not carry forward balances. So on your account class, make sure that the carry forward column for your assets, your liabilities, and your capital are marked as yes. As well as analytical dimensions. As you know, well, not as you know, but analytical dimensions as well has a carry forward management tab on here as well. So for those that analytical dimensions that maybe are attached to an asset or a liability, obviously you probably want to carry those over. But for most analytical dimensions that are attached to, say, an expense account, or you maybe have a department analytical dimension type and you have different analytical dimensions for department expenses. Obviously, those you don't want to carry forward. So make sure on the analytical dimension that this carry forward is either checked or unchecked. On the dimension type as well, if you would go to dimension type as well, there's the same question, and obviously that dimension type is more of a category, so it drives the settings. The setting on the analytical dimension itself does take precedent over the dimension type setting itself. So, but you might want to look at both of those to make sure that the carry forward is either checked or unchecked depending on the type of dimension. And lastly, on this particular slide, the fiscal year management. I talked about this, and I'll probably talk about it a couple more times. Make sure that your 2017 has been defined in your fiscal year management, as well as the periods for 2017. And obviously opening up 2017, and again, at least opening up January of the next year. And then lastly on this is run that year-end simulation. And it's under financials, utilities, and year-end simulation. And what this does is, it gives you an idea of what those journal entries will be at the end of the year without actually having to post. And I know most of you will not, well, I would hope none of you will actually closing the year for 2016 and probably till a month or two or even maybe 3 or 4 months into 2017. But this year-end simulation at least gives you an idea of what those journals will be. All right, so again, this is a screenshot of both, obviously, the fiscal periods and the fiscal year. So again, make sure that 2017 is open. And in this case, in my example here, I don't have it open, but make sure that it's open, as well as your periods January through December, if you will. As well as there is a parameter, it's under the supervisor column, and the parameter itself is ENDDAT. And I'll show you a little bit. I think I have a slide that actually shows you exactly where that is, but a lot of times this is set to 12/31, and maybe it could be set to 16. If you get to 12/31 or 01/01/2017, and this parameter is set to 12/31/16, you're going to have some bad luck posting anything to X3. So go to your general parameters, look up the supervisor group itself, find the parameter ENDDAT, and make sure that that parameter is set to a couple years in the future. So in our case, maybe set that to 12/31/2018 or even 2019. Again, if it's set to 12/31/16 or earlier, you'll have some hard time posting for next year anyway. All right, so part of closing the year as well is to kind of perform the following. Execute the dimension balance recovery function if necessary. So the dimension value recovery function, if you ever run across a report or an inquiry where you're looking at your dimension balances and they don't seem to be equal maybe what a different report shows. A lot of times when we go live, and hopefully as consultants we run that as soon as we enter those dimension balances. But if we missed it or if it needs to be ran again, what that does is tie up both of those tables. Dimensions are stored in a different table than your account balances, and sometimes they do get out of whack. So it doesn't hurt to run this dimension or this recovery, and I think it's also called I don't know that it's called a recovery in some of the newer versions, but it is a dimension balance itself, and it's found under the utility function. And if you don't have any issues with your dimensions and you still run this function, don't worry, it's not going to do anything unless you do have some issues. So it's just kind of a good idea, especially for some of you who are brand new to X3 this year that might have gone live. Go ahead and run that. It's not going to hurt anything if there's nothing wrong. Again, all invoices, I will repeat this again, but obviously all invoices must be validated either one by one or using a manual function or using a batch function. All receipts and payments must be validated, again, either using the batch posting or using it one by one. And at the time of the year, by the end of the year, hopefully everything is validated. But if you miss a few, that batch posting really does kind of help you grab all those that maybe you didn't catch with your business process itself. All recurring journal entries must be generated and posted as well. So for those of you who have set up recurring journal entries, make sure that you run those at the end of the month. As well as, again, we've talked about that, the final validation must be formed on all journals prior to closing. So obviously before you close the year, you need to validate all of those journals and move it from a temporary to a final status. Number 8, price updates for next year must be entered. So this isn't necessarily obviously if you don't enter your price updates for next year, it's not going to keep you from closing your books, but it is this is something for you to remember. So if you are using X3's purchasing and sales price lists, this is a good time of the year to make sure that you update those price lists or even copy a new price list or change the validity date of those price lists. If you've got something that expires 12/31/16, you might want to either, again, create a new price list or update that final date to include 2017. So again, not necessarily something that has to be done on a financial level, but it's a good thing to remember for obviously your customers and your purchasing price lists if you're using them. Again, cost transfers, cost calculations must be entered, and this is really important for all of you who are on standard costs. Again, this is a great time of year to look at those costs. Obviously, you all know that there's 4 buckets within X3. There's a budgeted cost. There's several different cost buckets that you can use to kind of simulate and run some simulations, and this would be the good time of year to do that as well. Not everyone obviously updates their costs until the beginning of next year because I'm not sure that you would want necessarily an inventory valuation change. Again, this is for standard costs, but it's a good time of year to start thinking about what those cost changes should be and then most likely implement them the 1st of January kind of thing. And then obviously you need to close all your periods for your current fiscal year. So once you are ready and you've closed, you're ready to close December, go ahead and do that. And make sure that most of your users, if not all of your users, are out of Sage X3. When you run that posting, it obviously goes through lots of different transactions, and sometimes it's just best to have everyone out so you don't catch some user that's in one transaction and it didn't get posted because they were in it. So good rule of thumb is just to make sure when you actually do close your periods and you're ready for that final close to make sure that all your users are out of X3 except for yourself, obviously. All right, closing the year continued. So when you are ready to close the year, maybe this is March now, and you've done your final audit. Maybe you've done an external audit. Everything looks good. You've made your adjusting entries or reversing entries if you needed to. To close the year, so we would want to run this FYE utility, and this will actually create that new period journal entry. So it'll move all your balances over. Obviously, it'll create the retained earnings account, or obviously update the retained earnings, which I hope everyone has good earnings for the year. But obviously, this is the utility that does that. If you've noticed here, there is a simulation box here. I would run this utility first as a simulation. Obviously, once you have to obviously specify the company, the ledger, if you have multiple ledgers, the fiscal year period, and what those documents are. We talked about what those journals and those documents are, so that's why it's important to have those created first. But here on the very bottom, there is a simulation. Go ahead and run that as many times as you wish, and obviously it does give you an idea of what those postings would be without actually posting new year or the new period itself. So you can run simulation as many times as you want, but I definitely would suggest running it the first time at least, just so you can kind of verify those postings. Obviously, this is the posting that it creates, so it obviously closes out all your profit and loss accounts. It establishes your retained earnings, and it establishes the opening balances for your balance sheet account itself. So this is an old dated the new period itself, but obviously this is the transaction. This is the actual transaction it does create. Just FYI, if you do run this utility and you create these transactions and you realize you made a mistake, maybe it's into March and you realize that, hey, we should have done something in December, obviously there is a utility in X3 to reopen the year. Once you reopen the year, it creates an adjustment to this particular journal entry itself. So it's not the end of the world. So just FYI, if you do run this and you realize after the fact that you need to do some other adjustments, go ahead and reopen the year. It'll create an adjustment to this entry, and then when you're ready again to close the year, obviously it'll create the new PR journal entries, which hopefully will be the correct amounts. Other considerations, obviously, is your fixed assets, your contacts, as I mentioned. Under fixed assets, you control your own fiscal years and fiscal periods. Obviously, those need to be open and closed or open and posted. Again, making sure that your January 2017 year and periods have also been defined in fixed assets as well. So you got to remember to do that in both places when it comes to those of you who are using fixed assets. Sage X3 obviously comes with two types of budgets, your typical expense budget or maybe your sales budgets. So create new budget codes, and as you know, they can be copied. So if you want to take your 2016 budgets and copy those to 2017, there's obviously utilities that do that. Your operational budgets, for those of you who are using it for maybe your CapEx, make sure that if you have any carryover budgets or any carryover amounts that you would like to put into 2017, make sure you calculate those. And under operational budgets, there is that utility to run so you can calculate any kind of carryover if you wish. Again, great time of year to update your standard costs. We've talked about that a little bit more. If you need a little bit more help with using your updated standard costs or the ability to use some of those buckets, I believe there's 4 buckets that you can kind of run and use as simulations. Do that, and please let us know, and we can help you through that. Obviously, a great time to update your BOMs and your routings, et cetera. Inventory valuation, again, great time to value your inventory, to do your report. If you want to do any kind of cost roll-ups, again, most people do cost roll-ups. We'll start analyzing this type of cost roll-ups this time of year, but not necessarily start doing that until the beginning of next year. But if you do want to do some cost roll-ups with revaluations, make sure that you do that. And you do, every once in a while, not every once in a while, there is a function when you do the roll-ups or when you do a revaluation, whether you want to post that revaluation to the general ledger. So if that's something you want to do, make sure you check that box when you do that. And then obviously the default dates. Update the date ranges for user access. So again, under the supervisor parameters, the DEF aspect. In fact, I think my next slide, I have a slide that shows you these dates. So I'm going to table this just for a second. Your financial reporting considerations, again, a lot of you using your FDE reporting. Some of you are using Sage Enterprise, or excuse me, Sage Intelligence. Some of you probably are using SEI. So for those of you who are using the FDE, just make sure that your prior period amounts are correct, that everything looks good, and just more of a verification itself. And remember that X3 is very period specific itself, so so make sure that you define that well. A lot of people don't know, just a little hint, that when you run your FDE report, and especially on the screen of X3, you can drill down to, and in this example of cash, I can drill down to cash and receivables and prepayments and look at the individual transactions as well. So, just do a quick audit of your balance sheet and your income statement, making sure that your prior figures are correct and so forth. All right, 1099. Obviously, some setup is required on your 1099s. On your supplier settings under common setting, there's obviously, or under common, there's obviously a setting that shows whether a supplier is a 1099 or not. So obviously that's important. There's the fee declaration, the 1099 processing is found under fee declaration. And make sure you obviously choose the United States fee declaration itself. So this is where you can specify, especially some of you who are brand new to X3, you might want to include a 1099 beginning balance to your suppliers. So if you have a beginning balance that was not included when you kind of went over to X3, obviously you can add a beginning balance to what exists in X3. Obviously you can still change the 1099 box and so forth. The process involved is to calculate your 1099 payments. It's the end of the year, but I have actually quite a few customers who run that calculate 1099 payments throughout the year. It gives them a little bit better idea of what those payments are throughout, and especially if you have a lot of 1099 customers. I wouldn't wait till the end of the year to run that, and you can run that as many times as you want, but it gives you a better idea of where things look as well. The 1099 payment summary, run that. It does give you the ability to edit invoices that are in the system now. So if you have an invoice that was marked as a 1099 and you've decided that it truly should not be a 1099 invoice, the 1099 payment summary obviously does give you the ability to remove that invoice or change the 1099 amount to a $0. I think it works vice versa as well. If you missed an invoice that you should have marked 1099, you can still come in here into this 1099 payment summary and change that to a where it was not a 1099 to a 1099 kind of invoice. X3 obviously does give you the ability to print some 1099 forms. It's obviously a Crystal report, so make sure that the Crystal report is updated. I do have a couple of clients who buy a $50 1099 program. They would still run all the setup through X3, but then they would just export an Excel file, and I'm not quite sure what the cost is, but it allows you the ability to transmit some of these 1099s electronically rather than the old-fashioned way of mailing things in. So you do have that option. If you have any questions about 1099s, or if you need some help with 1099s, please don't hesitate to reach out to one of the consultants, Olivia and I, or someone else, or your sales team, or someone from the sales team, and we'll make sure to help you through 1099s. It's pretty easy, but if you haven't done it the first time, you might want to have a 10-minute little session, if you will. Again, I've talked about fixed assets. Again, fixed assets is a true subsidiary ledger. It must be closed separately from the general ledger. So again, monitor, make sure that you've run your depreciation for the month. If there's if you've changed accounts, or if you've deleted some assets, or if you've sold your assets, obviously this accounting function here, this event not posted screen right here, will show you all of those events that have not been posted. So your depreciation, your sales, your disposals, etc. So make sure that that is done. Just FYI, fixed assets is not as easy. In fact, you can't, once you close a year in fixed assets, you can't open it up like you can on your general ledger. So fixed assets are a little less forgiving when it comes to closing it out. So make sure that you ran everything you need to do for the end of the year before you actually do that. The default date parameters, this is where I was talking a little earlier ago. So under the parameter values in your chapter SUP for supervisor, group DEF for your default values. Again, hopefully as consultants we've set this up for you, but these are default dates that actually drive when you pull up a report or when you pull up an inquiry what those default dates will be. So in this case, make sure your default date is most likely 01/01/2017, your end date to 12/31/2017. There's obviously a statistical start date here and an end date. And then the very last one is that END-DAT. This is probably the most important of all the values in this particular chapter. Make sure this value, in this case we have it set out all the way to 2021. If this is not set out a few years or even into next year, if this is marked as 12/31/16, again you'll have a hard time posting to X3. So make sure that that last value, the END-DAT, is correct. And then finally, your fiscal year, as I've said this over and over, it doesn't have to be closed immediately. And in fact, it's kind of recommended to keep it open for a couple of months. Obviously, you might have an internal audit, you might have an external audit, you might have both. But you don't have to require. In fact, I would strongly recommend not trying to close your fiscal year right away. So you can definitely keep that open for a while. We talked about that simulated aspect of it. If you do the simulated year-end, we'll update your beginning balances for most reports and inquiry screens. However, there is a flag that says to make sure you have that carry over, and we have it as an FYE flag, but oftentimes it's called carry over or carry forward, excuse me. So what this does is, without actually having to run a year-end, it will update those year-end balances. So if you look at your trial balance and so forth, it will update those reports without actually having to run that new period posting. And then lastly, and I guess this is just a plug for us, posting errors can be challenging. Oftentimes it's behind the scenes, it's using the accounting code and so forth, but if you have any issues with it, posting errors, please don't hesitate to give one of us a call or reach out to our support desk. And then finally, thank you for your time, and I hope you all have a happy holidays. Again, if you have any questions or if you need that year-end checklist, a hard copy, please let one of us know. Also, just to point out, we obviously have two customer account managers now. We have Gia Lane, she's our East Coast representative, and then we have Mike Scher, he's joined us in the last, I can't remember when he joined us, but he's joined us in the last few months. He is our West Coast account manager, and I've provided obviously the emails and phone numbers for them.